Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I'm Charlie Spears with Blockspace Media. Bitcoin Season 2 showcases new ideas and new conversations from new voices on Bitcoin. It's the technical and the cultural smashed together for an exciting era of discussion and ideation on the oldest blockchain. Bitcoin Season 2 is produced by Blockspace Media, an independent B2B Bitcoin media company focused on the business of block space. Make sure to check out our other shows, the Gwart Show, the Mining Pod. Find us on our YouTube and our website, blockspace.media. Also check out we're streaming everywhere. So here on X, Spotify, all of your RSS feeds. Make sure to subscribe to our newsletter where we post bi-weekly newsletters focusing on ordinals, mining pod, mining acquisitions. Where else do you hear all of these things put together in a Bitcoin tech forward language? So I'm joined by Tyler Whittle of the Taproot Wizards to chat briefly about CatVM and Parker Merrit of Coinmetrics to get in the weeds about the game theory and analysis behind the Bitcoin halving block tomorrow by looking at the DeGods block from last year. So before that, I'm going to, we're going to hit the news. We're going to cover just the interesting things that happened this week. So we're going to kick it off with, have to give Leonidas and the Ord.io team some props. Announced a $2 million pre-seed raise for Ord.io. They're focusing and pivoting into runes. Again, that's 24 hours from now, runes launch. So everybody and their dog is putting together some kind of runes project. Ord.io, clearly one of the market leaders, has been one of the great winners of the Explorer game in the Ordinals ecosystem, now pivoting into runes. Co-led by Bitcoin Frontier Fund and Sora Ventures, those guys are writing checks like crazy into this ecosystem. Love to see some business development. Also, we've got Casey dropped a blog. Casey Rodamore, inventor of Ordinal Theory, put together a blog on light pools, not necessarily related to ordinals, but just rather related to producing an interesting decentralized market using a network of gossip nodes. So basically, you've got a node and it can sign a BIP322 signature, and they can transmit all these UTXOs and sign transactions around, and it develops an interesting snipe resistant market. So that's one of the narratives going on right now, is like, there's some MEV going on Bitcoin. How do we reduce that? How do we prevent that? This is not in direct response to that, but it does coincide with this narrative being dominant on Bitcoin. Speaking of interesting things happening on chain, I put out this tweet because I was noticing some activity on the Bitcoin testnet. This was a fun story this week. I'm surprised nobody else is covering this. But basically, we saw what's called a block storm on testnet. A bunch of blocks come in on Bitcoin testnet. And lo and behold, Jameson Lopp, if you don't know who Jameson Lopp is, read your Bitcoin history book. He said, I left a calling card in the Coinbase. So let's just look. I mean, I'm just going to go into the testnet here. This is Memplot Space looking at the testnet blocks coming in. And you can see here block 2587452 in the Coinbase out in the Coinbase field, mined by Lopp, implying that was Jameson Lopp who mined that. But lo and behold, that's not the end of the story. Other new people have entered the chat, notably Hashbender. I can't find a block, but let's see one of these full blocks. This one appears to have been mined by someone, CK Pool, signing it not Lopp. So what's interesting here is we're actually seeing kind of a fun but also semi-serious competition on Bitcoin testnet, where Jameson Lopp is trying to mine empty blocks to crowd out people who are using testnet in a way which accrues value to the testnet Bitcoin on chain. This is generally considered to be like a negative impact on the testnet and developer ecosystem. So we're seeing Lopp take this matter into his own hands. It's fun to watch because we've also seen Luxor CEO Nick Hansen, or Hashbender, also get involved. I can't find a block that he's done, but he's also signing with a calling card courtesy of Hashbender. And it seems to me like a lot of other people are getting involved. I'm seeing a lot more um, calling cards pop up on testnet. So it's fun to watch testnet become a little PvP, also a little disheartening, but that's just the nature of the game. Anyway, without the last big season 2 related news this week is that Casey Rotimer announced that while he had floated the idea of hard coding the first 10 rune tickers into the protocol, he will not be doing that. He'll rather only be hard coding the first ticker into it. That is the uncommon goods. It's basically an infinite mint on Bitcoin for this epoch. This epoch ends, or infinite mint next epoch. This epoch ends in about 24 hours, or about 147 blocks. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up the top 3 wizards, probably. Tyler Whittle, welcome to the show, Tyler.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. Excited to be here. And
Yeah.
G Meow to Team Alive.
I am I once was team captain of Team Alive, so I guess I'm always team captain of Team Alive. So that was back in January, was the OpCat campaign, which kind of kicked off. I think a lot of us are wondering, it's like, where does this go? Do you just sell the inscriptions? Does it end there? Are the wizards gonna abscond with all our Bitcoin? Like, what's the purpose of all this? And I think
put them in our sack and we run away.
I know. I think we got some color one of the more playful and joyful things that we're seeing on Bitcoin these days. Tell me about CatVM.
Yeah, so CatVM is the first permissionless bridge on Bitcoin. And we're very excited about it. I think it opens the door to just solving a lot of the problems that we've had in bridging thus far. So in order to communicate this, Udi woke up one day and was like, guys, I had a dream last night. Instead of a white paper, we're going to do a children's book. And all of us were like, yeah, of course. Like, of course, that's the answer. There is no other answer. We absolutely need to make a children's book because white papers are just plain boring. As someone who did a PhD and whose job was to read boring ass papers for hours a day, I feel very credentialed in saying no one wants to do that. And so we thought the best way to do this is to create some fun illustrations to communicate this new thing that Reindell kind of cooked up in his giga brain and really distribute it to the world.
Yeah, so I look at this and it really begins to kind of flesh out what I see, like the trajectory of the Wizards being, and like some of the initiatives and actions you guys are going to do. Apologize to those who are listening to this. We're going to pull out a visual aid here, and I want to pull up the masterpiece that is this CatVM there and back again children's PDF, you might say.
And it is a full PDF. We learned yesterday in our spaces that some people only have seen the cover, and while the cover is amazing, there are another 13 pages that you can scroll through and learn the story of CatVM.
Okay, gotcha. So some people need to figure out how to click through to the PDF.
Yes, witters in English in particular are we're helping them become literate as days go by.
So like, what's the goal here? If you're trying to antagonize some of the more stodgy old Bitcoiners, I feel like this is the wrong way to do it. This, if anything, almost kind of is like a warming, greeting, an invitation to recapture the magic of what you guys are trying to propose. Talk to me about how you are thinking about simplifying something kind of abstract and technical like OpCat in this children's storybook form.
Yeah, so I think if you read through the story, if you actually go through the 13 pages, the story we tried to write is one of kind of the failing of bridges thus far in Bitcoin. So I think from a very early time in Bitcoin's history, there was this idea that Bitcoin could scale in layers, that eventually we would reach this promised land. And so the story we try to tell is kind of, okay, what has happened in Bitcoin's history and trying to get to these other places. So the page right before that is the multi-sig Madlands, which I think, maybe Bitcoin is a little less culpable on this one than some other chains that we won't mention on this podcast. But uh, we all know the perils of a multi-sig bridge, right? Multi-sig bridges are great. They're very quick. They're very efficient right up until they're not. So as long as 5 of 8 people, or 6 of 9 people, or however many of those signers do what they're supposed to do, multi-sig bridges are great. And as soon as they don't, then everyone's money is gone. Like, poof, goodbye. See you later. And so multi-sig bridges aren't what we would call trustless. Like, you're trusting people, you're not trusting the code to execute properly. And so that was the first thing we really wanted to get across there. And then as we go down, we look at Lightning, and I think Lightning has, it's been the promise of Bitcoin for such a long time, but I called it the Lightning Wastelands, and we have some people doing mental gymnastics, convincing themselves
having
that
to
Lightning
jump
is
through
still
a
going to be
hoop
a thing.
having to jump through a hoop to make it work.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, I don't think Lightning is that scaling solution that's right for Bitcoin. And as we see, the majority of people using Bitcoin today are, I think, ordinals users. I think it's the ordinals degens that are becoming very quickly the majority of Bitcoin users. And Lightning just does not, you can't port ordinals over to Lightning. So it just doesn't scale Bitcoin in that way. And more technically, it relies on these things called pre-signed transactions. And pre-signed transactions are kind of the root of all evil in bridge design right now, that I think we've had very smart people try and figure out how to get around. And BitVM is probably the prime example of that case of how can we get around this fact that we have to rely on these pre-signed transactions. And I think at the end of the day, the answer is simple. Like, we cannot. Like, the way we get around them is by soft forking in a covenant like Opcat. And so that's, the book starts kind of going through the challenges we face thus far. And then it goes on to talk about, okay, well, what is this CatVM thing that we've, concocted, and how does it work, and what does it do?
So I want to keep this pretty high level because we are going deeper next week. You and Ryan will
Yeah.
be joining me. We'll kind of talk about how the story was created, and maybe some of the details, and both technical and creative components of this. So I don't want to spoil that too much, but this is a nice resolution, I feel, to the perhaps spicy, uh, notorious article from a week or two ago on the BitVM bridging, because I like to see this narrative kind of conclude, and yeah, we're moving towards providing really productive tools to drive forward conversation. You know, um, when I see this, I start to see how the Taproot Wizards are really leaning into your goal of jumpstarting this narrative of discovery and forward motion on Bitcoin. What do you hope starts to come out of this particular cat paper, if you will, this children's storybook?
Yeah. So I think what has been really exciting so far is seeing the community reception. The Ordinals community has been very excited. But even beyond that, within the technical community, Shinobi wrote a great article from Bitcoin Magazine. The only downside of his article, he called my writing childish narratives instead of Pulitzer quality prose. But besides that, it does a pretty good job of highlighting a lot of the technical things that we've unlocked here. And so it's been good to see that I think it's given the Ordinals community something to say, hey, look, guys, like we didn't just take your funds and run away. I think we're a very much a show don't tell company. And so if you don't hear from us, that's probably a good thing. That probably means we're back there tinkering with something. And then on the technical side, we've seen a lot of people who are highly respected in the technical community say, wow, like this actually gives us really good primitives to do what it is we want to do to build the bridges that we want to see, the safe, secure, trustless, permissionless types of bridges. And so that's here we are on the grand CatVM bridge with people going across to off chain and finding the wonders that it holds.
Trustless swaps, snarks. I know what those are. I've never heard of plasma cash. That was a deep cut from me. But yeah, this is really interesting.
That's because you're a Bitcoin maxi. You didn't spend. You needed to spend some years in Ethereum to really get your plasma brain going.
Yeah, so I'm always open to learn. Apprehensive as every longtime maximalist is, but also not totally closed to new ideas. I really love to see this. It brings like warmth to the cold, dark forest that is the business of Bitcoin sometimes. So without I want to kind of tease again that we're going to recap this. We're going to reprise this much deeper next week, you, me, and Rindell. So make sure to tune into that longer form pod. So yeah, thanks for joining. Any last words on the CatVM white paper, Tyler?
No, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to really run into it, full steam ahead next week. And yeah, the only words are, if you saw the Twitter link and thought it was only a single page, it turns out it is a full book. And I highly recommend checking out the entire thing.
Rock on. I also strongly recommend. Thank you, Tyler. I'm going to take you down. And now we're going to switch to chatting about the Bitcoin halving block. I've got Parker Merrit with me. Parker of CoinShares, friend of the show, friend of the block. Welcome, Parker.
Appreciate it, Charlie. Great to be back on Block Space Media twice in 1 week. That's got to be some kind of record there.
Yeah, pray we don't start another podcast because then you'll be working around the clock. Yeah. So yeah, we're if you manage to stay with us, Parker and I will probably get kind of technical, but this is we're going to talk about something which I think is really interesting. I'm surprised more people are not talking about this. We have the halving coming up, and everyone's talking about the issuance adjustment. This is a very well explored topic, but nobody's talking about what I think is one of the more interesting things is that we have a telegraphed block height for a very competitive fee scenario, right? Block 840,000, everybody and their dog is going to be trying to get and launch and mint their runes as Casey's runes begins on block 840,000. But I did a little primer on this past week in the Blockspace newsletter saying that, well, we've seen fee spikes before. We've seen high fee scenarios, but we haven't seen like a telegraphed fee like block where everybody's trying to get transactions into a very specific block. So what was an under discussed story last year, March of 2023, the DeGods inscription collection sold in a bidding, like in an auction process, the collection, and the auction happened at a certain block height. And we saw some interesting activity on Bitcoin itself during this block height as fees burst onto the chain. So I've got Parker here because Parker did really the only real deep dive, I think, on this. Let's just start at the beginning. Roll the very high level, Parker. What is a reorg? What is a reorganization in Bitcoin block production terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of background, I work for Coinmetrics, which is an institutional grade data provider in the crypto space. And, we monitor all things in the markets and on chain. But of course, there's a lot of things that happen outside of the blockchain that are also very interesting, especially from a risk management perspective, knowing when your transactions actually settle. So, there's things you can monitor in the mempool, things you can monitor by plugging into mining pool stratum servers. And one big thing that you might want to look out for is a reorganization event on the blockchain. Essentially, a reorg is when the blockchain is accepted to be in a certain state. Everybody agrees on what is the longest chain, which block is the valid block at the end of that chain tip. And in instances where there's disagreements about which block is at the end of that chain tip, essentially there could be a reorganization event where there's confusion in the community about what's the valid chain. And when subsequent blocks are mined on top of either chain, that can cause everybody to shift over to that next longest chain. So essentially, it's really based on your point of view. Each node has a different perspective on which chain is valid. But in this instance, we saw quite a bit of disarray, especially in the ordinals and inscription space, as a result of not really accounting for reorgs happening and kind of changing the accepted state of ordinals indexes. So that's a little bit of background on what a reorg is, and then also how that interfaces with the ordinals and inscription sphere, because of course ordinals are based on the sequence of transactions in a block, and when that block changes or the sequence of transaction changes, that kind of screws the whole thing up, right?
Yeah, so we saw this happen a lot last spring. Like a lot of the indexers, the ordinals indexers broke anytime there was a reorg, and that is now largely fixed. I believe some of these indexers, some of them are different, but they basically have kind of a fallback check they can go back to. It's very similar to a lot of exchanges. So like I remember Coinbase had like a 6 block deep requirement that you couldn't, your funds were not able to be used on Coinbase until 6 block confirmations. So we see a similar kind of strategy on the ORD client. But set the stage for me, Parker. Here, like what did we see last March? I forget which block number it is. We saw at block height 781,277. What did we see in that moment? And I'll bring up the slides here in a sec, or unless you want me to bring them up right now just to talk through it.
We can give a little bit of background first.
Yeah.
Essentially, what we saw is, like you mentioned, there are certain blocks that are telegraphed ahead of time to be, the time at which a certain event will occur, particularly in the ordinal space, just like we have with the launch of runes on the halving block. Block 781,279, actually, so 2 blocks ahead of the block we're discussing here, was telegraphed to be the mint for DeGods, which was a major and really hyped up collection. So 2 blocks prior to that block, we saw a block come in from Foundry Pool, one of the, if not the largest mining pool, depending on your day. And they currently control around 28% of the hash rate share. So naturally, everybody saw this block come in and accepted that as kind of the valid state of the blockchain. It's Foundry, they're the top mining pool. This is considered to be the longest valid chain. Shortly after Foundry mined that block, we also saw a block come in from Via BTC. So this was within a few seconds. They successfully also mined a block at that same height. So that sets the stage. There's a conflict between these 2 mining pools. Via BTC, a bit smaller than Foundry, but still around 13 to 14% dominance on any given day. So that's where, this contention kind of comes in, is having 2 different blocks at the same height from 2 relatively major mining pools.
So that sets the stage, and that's when I'll bring up this great slide deck you've provided me. And let's just jump right into it. Like, whenever we're trying to predict the future, it's always good to look to the past. You bring in this case study of a multi-block reorg on Bitcoin SV from a few years ago. Talk me through this.
Yeah, so essentially, kind of as you mentioned, if you're an exchange that is supporting a proof of work asset, it is important to kind of stay on top of how many confirmations a given transaction had, how many blocks have been built at the end of that chain tip. And, for Bitcoin, the assumption is 3 to 6 blocks. And of course, exchanges at the time had a much higher threshold for how many blocks they would accept from BSV because they have a much lower hash rate. And, kind of as we discussed with Bitcoin Cash on the mining pod, it's relatively effortless for a miner to switch between those ecosystems. So what we saw here was a large amount of hash rate come online, SHA-256 hash rate, onto the Bitcoin SV network that wasn't previously there. And they began to initiate a 51% attack. And this is kind of the most extreme case where you might see a reorganization event. So ultimately, this miner was able to roll back the Bitcoin SV blockchain, kind of reverse the set of transactions that was previously believed to be confirmed by at first a dozen blocks. And I believe ultimately it was around 100 blocks based on some reporting that we saw after. So essentially, that set the blockchain in disarray. People weren't able to understand whether their transaction had safely confirmed or not. And so while we haven't seen anything this extreme in the Bitcoin ecosystem, most reorgs are around 1 to 2 blocks, at the very most 3 or 4. It's been higher in the past due to things like bugs, but in recent history on Bitcoin, certainly nothing like this. But this is kind of why it's important is, if you want to prevent yourself from receiving a double spent transaction, you have to know the right amount of blocks in terms of confirmations after your transaction is settled.
So we get now into the play-by-play. This chart can take a little second to fully follow if you've not looked or really thought about a Bitcoin chain split. But talk me through what happens, Parker. This is a live look, or this is a look at this step-by-step split that happened at block 781277.
That's right. So we gave a little bit of background on this leading up to this chart, but essentially on the x-axis you see UTC time, and on the y-axis you see the block height. So at block height 781277, just before the DeGods mint, you saw both Foundry and Via BTC mine blocks at the same height. So essentially these two chains are in contention. They disagree about the state of the blockchain. And now all we have to do is wait for another miner to build on top of either chain. And that would sort of cement it as the longest proof of work chain. And canonically, that's the valid Bitcoin blockchain. What you actually saw happen is Via BTC got very lucky in this instance and happened to mine the very next block just a few minutes later. So that at that point was considered the canonical Bitcoin blockchain. And of course, Foundry had the option to kind of ignore Via BTC's block, just like Via BTC did them. But subsequently, we also saw another block come in from Antpool, building on top of Via BTC's chain. And eventually, Foundry capitulated and mined another block on top of Via BTC's chain at 781283. So that kind of shows you, the constant tug of war that's going on between mining pools. They don't necessarily always have to agree on the valid state of the blockchain, especially when the incentives are right.
Gotcha. This chart took me a little second to follow. Can you talk me through this chart again? If you're listening to this, I'd recommend pulling up the YouTube or the Twitter X live stream, because this is very useful visualization.
Yeah, absolutely. So this shows you a little bit more on what's actually going on under the hood, how these mining pools are reacting to what's going on around them. So as we discussed, Foundry and Via BTC both mine blocks at 781277. Actually, within seconds of each other, Via BTC's block actually came in around 6 or 7 seconds after Foundry's. And what you see pictured here in this visualization is essentially how many different chain tips we have, how many different versions of the blockchain mining pools are working on. And so Foundry mined their block, and the majority of mining pools converged onto that chain. But you can see up here at the top in yellow, there was one pool that did not immediately switch to mining on top of Foundry's chain. And of course, that's via BTC, the competing block that was, kind of also vying for the valid state at 781.277. So this went on for about 5 or 6 minutes via BTC, just holding out hope that they will successfully mine another block on top of their existing chain. And eventually they did. And, this is a bit of an anomaly, a mining pool successfully mining 2 blocks in a row in such a short period of time. And very briefly, this threw mining pools into disarray. You saw 2 and then 3 different chain tips emerge. But finally, again, based on the rules of proof of work, the longest chain being the valid canonical Bitcoin blockchain, all the other pools, including Foundry, converged on via BTC's chain. And that kind of awards them the rewards.
Yeah. And I want to try to be clinical, but I also want to ask, some of the real questions, which is, you mentioned this is a bit of an anomaly where I don't know how many people are scrutinizing, like, how many pools are mining at various chain tips that closely. But, in your experience, do you see this kind of thing happen a lot? Or is this increasingly curious given the telegraphed nature of the DeGods auction sale block height?
I would say, this is somewhat unusual, at least in terms of reorgs in general. I believe they don't happen more than, once every month or 2 months. Increasingly unusual is, of course, the reorg happening and the same pool mining the 2 blocks that were sort of the source of contention. And then, the most suspicious part of this being this happened right around the time of the DeGods block. Keep in mind, this was all actually leading up to that block. So via BTC did not ultimately earn the transaction fees that were associated with that mint. Ant Pool did. And, what kind of complicates the picture is we're seeing a lot more discussion around who Ant Pool is in cahoots with. Very recently, a Bitcoin analyst, 0xB10C, called out that if you look at the stratum jobs that each mining pool is sending out, many of these tend to resemble what Ant Pool is putting out, essentially implying that Ant Pool is the one that's deciding which transactions go into a block. And, as we discussed in the mining pod, around 7 of the major mining pools are implicated here. So it does kind of beg the question, is via BTC or any of these other pools working in conjunction with Ant Pool to guarantee some preference on certain blocks?
I will note that in 0xB10C or whatever, in that researcher's post via BTC was not part of the list of pools using identical block templates to Ant Pool. So this is an interesting additional piece of information. This is the last chart you have here, which I really like because it helps visualize like the burst of transactions that happened block to block. It helps kind of visualize, like, we see very clearly here at block height 781.278 the burst of transactions which are confirmed in that block. Can you talk me through this particular chart and visualization?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, as I mentioned, it's important to kind of look at everything that's going on outside of the blockchain as well as what's confirmed on the chain itself. And one of the other interesting things to look at is when transactions are seen in the mempool. So you kind of see a pattern generally of a lot of transactions arriving kind of late in the time that's passed since the last block. So as you mentioned, it's pretty unusual to see a burst of high fee-paying transactions coming in before that block, time has kind of passed. So that's kind of what we can expect to see in the halving is, not a big backlog of transactions building up prior to the halving block, but as soon as that halving block comes in, you can expect to see all kinds of high fee-paying transactions come into the mempool. And one thing that we haven't discussed is, in addition to the debut of runes, there's also a lot of discussion around this epic sat. And according to ordinal theory, there's a certain rarity associated with each Satoshi, each unit of Bitcoin. There's 100 million Satoshis in each Bitcoin. And the first Satoshi to be minted after a halving is considered an epic sat, an especially rare sat. I think, obviously, we've only had 3 halvings in history so far. So this will be the 4th epic Satoshi ever made. So that's all the more reason to believe these mining pools are going to compete heavily for claim to that block. There are some people who have quoted the value of this epic Satoshi at millions of dollars or more. Based on that value, there are some who claim that there's an incentive for a very intentional reorg, plausibly up to 30 or 40 blocks. Now, whether that's actually what plays out and what happens if these mining pools really think the juice is worth the squeeze for, something that could be very contentious in the community and also potentially wasteful for their mining contributors, is still an open question. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a 1 or 2 block reorg, especially if a pool like Foundry happens to mint that halving block. You can bet that Antpool and perhaps some of the pools that are working in conjunction with Antpool may not accept that as the valid state of the blockchain.
Yeah, and at the top of the show, I mentioned that we were looking at testnet. Increasingly, testnet appears to be where a lot of the alpha happens. We are seeing an operator appear to experiment with block reorgs currently. So all eyes on that. It appears that the game theory could be playing out. Like, what do we look for, Parker? Like, what do we look for when we in the blocks leading up to the halving and leading up to 840K and maybe even beyond, because this could be a major sustained fee spike event. Like, what do we look for as researchers, Coinmetrics, watching when blocks come in? Like, maybe you don't look for it live, but like, what might we see if we start to see competition heat up in preparation for 840K?
Yeah, so of course, one of the things that we're looking at is the number of mining pool tips, what templates different mining pools are working on. And that is very difficult data to collect, because you do actually have to plug into each Stratum server and, get the state of the template that pools are sending to miners. I think, one thing that might be a little bit more directly observable for some folks is whether or not there's any strange drop-offs in terms of hash rate for certain mining pools or the number of blocks found by mining pools. One of the other elements that could throw a wrench in here is the concept of selfish mining, essentially a pool mining blocks in secret, but not broadcasting those blocks to their peers in an attempt to build a longer chain without their competitors knowing. And of course, this sets other pools at a disadvantage if they're working at an old block height, an outdated chain tip without knowing it. And that might be a strategy that, a adversarial mining pool could use to, again, throw things into disarray and try and get an early swipe at that halving block.
This is a big bounty, because there's both the epic sat, as you say, and this massive fee spike event. I just kind of like put a finger in the wind to just be the first person to even do any kind of like evaluation on what the size of the fee could be. And if we look at the DeGods block, that was what, 3 Bitcoin or so, which the total US dollar value at the time for that block was about little over $500,000. And if we saw that kind of activity happen at that kind of bounty amount for a block, and we consider the reality that I know someone would pay more than $500,000 just for the epic sat. If we just imagine that the interest in runes is maybe 1 order of magnitude than DeGods, we're looking at a $5 to $10 million on the lower end, on the lower boundary, like bounty, like expected EV from this block 840K. Like, how do we even go about predicting or evaluating the carrot incentive to conduct mining games around this? Do you just multiply like expected revenue per block and go back that many blocks? Or, I mean, how do you even like come up with you mentioned like this like 30 block reorg. I mean, does that play into it? Just kind of trying to evaluate and ballpark the total, amount of money on the table. How do you think through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it obviously depends heavily on the actual appetite for runes, how long that spike in transaction fee persists. The 30 to 40 block estimate is definitely on a much higher end. But, if there's a 10 to, 20 block period where transaction fees remain high unabated, then, certainly that heightens the risk of a reorg event happening. Because, again, you got to take into account the fact that at the same time this fee spike is happening, the block reward has dropped in half. So proportionally, let's say, fees are just even equivalent to what happened on the DeGods block. That's a 50-50 proportion. So transaction fees are going to be more important to miners and mining pools than ever. And of course, the mining pools themselves do have kind of direct unilateral control over what happens with that Epic Satoshi. Blockspace was kind of the first to break that Foundry was going to hold that Epic Satoshi in reserve for their miners, auction it off and distribute the proceeds. But not every mining pool might do the same for their miner constituency. So I think it all depends on, which mining pool succeeds in mining that halving block. I've seen a lot of people say it would be especially entertaining to see Ocean Pool mine that block. Who knows what they would do with that Epic Satoshi?
Well, we actually do know, because
Yeah.
one of their officers said it goes to whoever's pointing the most hash rate to us, which I think is one of the best marketing It's not clearly not a marketing tactic, but I love it because it's just like, it makes me want to put all my hash rate to Ocean, because now
Very true.
maybe I get that Epic Sat. This is a really, really fun conversation. Parker, you got any final thoughts leading into the halving and the block building games?
Yeah, I mean, just about 24 hours away, so pretty exciting. I was hoping more miners would turn off their hash rate and allow us to get that solid 420 date. Looks like it's going to be a little bit earlier than that, but that being said, with all these shenanigans going on, maybe don't celebrate the halving exactly when that block comes in. It could be rewritten. Other things could go on that change exactly how that halving plays out. And going forward, definitely expecting to see a lot more MEV type shenanigans. So, the mining space is more interesting than ever, all thanks to ordinals and now runes.
Yeah, shout out Parker, shout out Coinmetrics. Parker, I would love to see you live tweet the halving from the perspective of a listening node. It would be a really fun thing to watch. So thank you so much, Parker. Make sure to hit up Parker Merrit on Twitter, and you can see him obviously on pretty much every other Blockspace media event right now. So thank you so much for joining, Parker. So thank you for joining the Blockspace live stream. We do this Thursday nights. Tomorrow I have a special treat. We are dropping an interview with both Casey and Raph of the Ordinals protocol. So be on the watch tomorrow morning for a great interview I had with the two of them just on the past year and the future of Ordinals and Runes. All right. Thank you so much. Make sure to like and subscribe. Follow us on social media. Look for the newsletter. Blockspace.media is the website. See you later.